the topic of this particular discussion. And so the question is a GMO a genetically engineered bacteria that has a human gene in it that's synthesizing insulin that many people who have diabetes takes and helps them control that disease and has helped hundreds of millions of people around the globe? Is a GMO a genetically engineered human being? And there are genetically engineered human beings that are GMOs. That may surprise a lot of you, but that's a fact. In other words, there's people that have been born with lethal genetic diseases that had genes in them that they weren't born with that allow them to be alive because that lethal genetic disorder has been essentially overcome, and they're healthy because they have a good gene in them. And so there's many, many, many examples of GMOs, whether it's bacteria, whether it's humans, or whether it's plants. And I think it's important to point out that genetic engineering, the kind of genetic engineering that we're talking about today, is 43 years old. I mean, it's, to us, what we do in the lab today, it's almost like a Model T Ford. Now, I know that all of you are here to discuss the GMOs that you hear most frequently. A lot of tremendous misinformation about it. Hopefully we can clarify these things. I don't really have any axe to grind. I'm just here to educate. But the real point is that we have a real problem facing agriculture today, and I know Dave is really aware of that as well. And those of us who work at the bench and do research every day of the week, we're very concerned about the fact that there's enormous population growth. We're going to go to 9 billion people or more in the next 50 years. We have tremendous decrease in land for agriculture, so we can't grow a lot of crops and a lot of land because the land is decreasing. We have a tremendous amount of decrease in resources for agriculture. Look in California, namely water. So we have to do a lot more with a lot less. And then we're really facing a really serious problem, which is probably more serious than all of it, and that's climate change. And all of you grow plants in your gardens and your houses. You know that they're very susceptible to temperature and different lighting conditions. And climate change is really part of the perfect storm because unless we solve the ability to grow plants under different conditions and crops, we're going to have some very, very, very serious problems with food shortages and all kinds of things. And so genetic engineering of crops, and it's been used now for 30 years, is not a panacea. It's not going to solve all of the problems, but it's just one tool in the toolbox. And in order to overcome a lot of problems in agriculture, we have to use all the tools that we have: classical breeding, agronomy, sustainability, water resources, and use the best science possible.
Thank you, Bob, for that. I think you're 3 minutes up. What a great introduction, folks. So now, at this point, I got a lot of questions for these guys, but start thinking of your questions too, because I'm only going to have them for a little while, then you're going to have them for more. So start thinking about your questions. We're going to have a wireless mic going around the audience, so start thinking of them now. But to get us started, let me first ask a question, something that both sides brought up, and that's about hunger and poverty and global poverty. And I wanted to ask both of the speakers here today about global poverty and whether or not you think, is it a talking point or is it a reality that having genetically modified food will increase harvest, increase yields, make it more likely to have food in places that's harder to grow food? Or is it just a talking point? And if you don't mind, maybe we'll reverse the order, Dave, you can address that.
I'll let the professor answer that one first.
You know, I think 40,000 people die every single solitary day with malnutrition or hunger, and most of them are kids. It's horrible. And most of that's due to political conditions and sociological conditions. And no matter how much food we make, if the food can't get to people, it's not going to do any good. And no amount of genetic engineering, no amount of really excellent science is going to be able to overcome that unless we really, really have changes in political structures and sociological structures so that we can get good food to people. But I will say that over the last 100 years, we have increased the yield of crops by about 300%. And so in the United States, we spend less than 5% of our disposable income on food. But in some parts of the world, they're spending 85 to 95% of the disposable income on food. It's a matter of life or death. So we do need to increase the yield of crops in order to be able to feed a burgeoning population. But I think what we're seeing around the world is really a tragedy, and that's really more a function of politics. And I don't think any amount of GMOs or genetic engineering is ever going to solve that.
Well, listen, I think that's an important question. What are we doing as a society to produce food for people? Especially what are we doing as a society to produce people that don't have access to it? How are we getting that? Genetically engineering foods, any single crop, is not going to feed the hungry. And the fact is, the science has shown from the very beginning, the process of genetic engineering does not increase yield. Actually, by inserting foreign genes into a plant, you are actually going to decrease yield. There's a yield drag. It's up to 3 to 7%. It's very well known. Even the USDA's own scientists came out with a study at the University of Wisconsin in 2011. So the fact is, genetic engineering is not going to feed people. Monsanto is not here genetic engineering food because they want to feed hungry people in Africa. What they're really doing is they genetically engineered the food for two major traits. One is to be Roundup Ready resistant, so it could be survive being sprayed with Roundup, which is a weed killer that contains glyphosate, which is probably carcinogenic. The real fact is about GMO agriculture, and so I'm from Iowa. 97% of the soybeans grown in Iowa are genetically engineered. You all spray Roundup on those. The fact is, this first generation of genetically engineered crops is failing rapidly in farmers' fields. This is what critics have predicted from the beginning. It's what Food Democracy Now! Has been saying for the last 8 years. And I'll just say, there's 80 million acres of superweeds because farmers have relied too much on Roundup and the Roundup Ready GMO cropping system. So the other thing, the other gene they have is 80 to 85% of them are genetically engineered to have a Bt toxin, which is an insecticide. It kills plants. Now Monsanto and the biotech industry have a convenient talking point that it reduces insecticide use. It's correct. They're not spraying as much insecticide chemical on those plants, but they've actually weaponized that corn. So every single part of that plant contains a Bt toxin. So we have unintended consequences of the Bt toxin being inserted in this gene in corn. What is that unintended consequence? In farm fields across the Midwest, starting in Iowa, in Minnesota, Nebraska, and Illinois, the Bt toxin that they genetically engineered into these corn crops is failing, and it's failing significantly. So what happens when you genetically engineer an insecticidal gene into a crop that's adopted by 90% of farmers and it starts to fail? It's a pretty catastrophic situation if you don't. And so the real thing is genetic engineering, the current process that they've set up is a chemical treadmill. It's going to get worse and worse. So now we're having food that has very high levels of glyphosate residue. So the Obama administration has approved new GMO crops that are Roundup Ready and dicamba ready, and Roundup Ready and 2,4-D ready. So it basically means you're going to be eating food with residues on it with Roundup and glyphosate and 2,4-D. Now, the U.S. government has never done testing on crop residues, but we know people who have, and the numbers are going to shock people pretty quickly. So I'll just say, science is not a panacea to major problems that we have. The problem is we have corporate control of our government, and we have corporate control of our media. The fact is, you can barely get an honest conversation in the mainstream media about genetic engineering because biotech scientists and Monsanto harass any journalist who will write a fair and balanced. And they've driven, not only do they drive scientists out of universities when you're critical of them, they also drive journalists out of these publications because they're telling the truth about the major failings and flaws in genetic engineering.
Well, you brought up a lot of points there, Dave, and I want to give Bob a chance.
I don't even know where to start.
Some of them.
My God, I don't even know where to start at all.
Yeah, we talked about corporate control of media. We talked about the government studies and how they may be flawed, and then we talked about the point that I would like to ask Bob to address, really, which is the use of pesticides on the crops. So the crops are designed to be pesticide resistant, so that way they can produce higher yields and eliminate the weeds. And so, Bob, if you don't mind, I wanted to talk to that point about, is that a bad thing? Should we be concerned that, and is it even true that more pesticides are being used, and does that pose any type of health consequence for us?
Well, let me go back and respond to some of the things that Dave said. I'm a scientist and I'm not a politician, and I go by the science. And I'm a member of the National Academy of Science. I'm also on the Board of Agriculture, which advises the President of the United States and Congress on agricultural policy. And so I've studied genetic engineering policy and genetic engineering safety for a very, very long time. This is an old technology. There's been many, many National Academy of Science reports, British Royal Society reports that have examined the data, scientific data, over the last 35 years in which these crops have been produced. Every scientific organization in the world looking at very critical studies, very objective studies, not by Monsanto scientists or DuPont scientists or anybody else, have stated that the genetically engineered crops on the market today are perfectly safe for animal and human consumption. When Dave talks about yield, I've engineered canola plants. When you buy canola oil and use it for your cooking, probably they had some of the genes that we discovered at UCLA that helped grow those plants. And the fact is that they don't have yield drag. That's nonsense. These crops have
So
a
soybeans don't have a yield drag?
They have a 22% increase in yield, which means you can grow a lot more on
Not
a lot
because
less.
of genetic engineering,
And
though.
so it's due to the genetic engineering because we were able to genetic engineering a process that allows them to be hybrid crops, which would not have been allowed before because genetic engineering allowed them to be hybrids, which increases yield significantly. The fact is that recent reports have come out have shown that the yields of crops, not so much in the United States because most of the farmers are using really good seeds which have really good genetic backgrounds, but in other parts of the world where you use genetic engineering to boost the yield of crops, it's clear that the yield is really increased anywhere from 7 to 15 to 20%.